of Palestine. Now, the genocide in 1948 was not complete. The Zionist movement was not successful in cleansing, between quotations, the Palestinians from their homeland. And so an apartheid system was put in place. Apartheid is the second best option after a genocide for a settler colonial movement. If you can't remove the indigenous population, then you impose a system of oppression and domination on them, that you keep them always at a disadvantage, oppressed, dominated, unable to challenge, and at best maybe they can serve you in whatever. That system that was put in place was based on the following pillars. It's the fragmentation of the indigenous population, so the spreading of them, the creation of the differences, the divide and rule kind of, a principle. It was the dispossession, it's the taking away of homes, properties, not leaving not leaving the indigenous population with what they have, and deprivation is always keeping them at a socio-economic disadvantage, right? Always below you. Always poor, always weak, always unhealthy, and so on. And the system would be maintained through basically violence that takes different forms, through forced displacement, through the systematic killings, through the systematic torture, systematic detention, and so on. Now, that system that was put in place in 1948 was expanded into what is now called occupied Palestinian territories, the West Bank and Gaza, in 1967, when it was occupied. And very important here, because always the word occupation is used to describe a situation, when military occupation is really just a tool of the settler colonial project, of the apartheid project. It was used against Palestinians who remained, who the settler colonial project could not eliminate or forcibly displace out in 1948. Palestinians in Jaffa, Haifa, the Galilee, the Naqab, were placed under military rule. That military rule, Palestinians, we say we were always under military rule. It was only a short break of a few months when Israel ended, kind of formally, the military rule against Palestinians in what became Israel, but then occupied the West Bank and Gaza Strip in a military rule that still exists until today. Military rule is a tool of this. And all the way to today, that we see a genocide again happening. And the genocide, in the words of the Zionist leaders, is the continuation of the Nakba. Is the bringing of Nakba 2.0, for example. This is a quote from Israeli leaders. Is the Nakba of Gaza, for example, as one of the ministers said. It's the completion. You hear the chanters of those who march, the settlers who march in Jerusalem, in the old city, with Israeli flags, something that you're very familiar with here in Belfast. We will complete the job, right? The job meaning we will complete the job of 1948. So I'm mentioning all of this because I think it's very important to understand the moment we're in, the genocide in Gaza, this colonial violence in this context, because this is the only way we can understand it, and this is the only way we can really understand what to do about it then, right? Because if we don't have that full understanding, we will not be able to confront it in a meaningful way, to bring it to an end and really bring a change to the situation. So that's the macro level, right? The other way, and very crucial, which I've seen and really heard some of the very inspiring stories today at the school I visited, but also at other places, is the understanding at the micro level. And the micro level are the personal stories of Palestinians, of individual Palestinians, of Palestinian families, Palestinian communities. And the stories can be the newborn babies who were left in the hospital in Gaza to die, an experience that is basically 0 days or a few days, basically no life experience, but that tell the whole story here, that can really reflect all that macro, understanding that I've just told, or stories of families who have been displaced 1 and 2 and 3 times, stories of people losing their homes, mothers losing their children, and so on. But I think I'm best here to talk about my own for a little bit, and I want to do that as a kind of segue into the other part of my talk. And it's in a way my story, but also a story of my generation. So I was born in the early 1980s, 1983, a year after the Palestinian Liberation Organization was expelled out of Lebanon to Tunisia, when Israel put Beirut in Lebanon under a siege that is very similar, to the siege that was put on Gaza, that Gaza has been living since 2006, 2007. Of course, Gaza actually has been under siege since the 1950s, if you want to go into history, but this is perhaps for another time. And the Palestinians were pushed out of the sea. And I want to mention this because right now what is happening in Gaza is exactly the same thing. Palestinians are to be displaced, and this is expressed by many Israeli leaders. If they are to be forcibly displaced out by land through Egypt, that's great. If not, well, we'll bring the Americans and build a port in Gaza, and this way we can put the Palestinians on ships and send them away. And this is really what's happening. The US is right now building a port in Gaza, and the only reason we see this port is made for is to actually put Palestinians on boats eventually and send them out. I went to school, started school in 1987, which is the first Intifada. Intifada's uprising. It's when Palestinians collectively, grassroots, took action against the Israeli apartheid settler colonial occupation. I remember one of my first understanding of what Israel and occupation is. I was, I think, 7 or 8 years old, and next to my school was a post office, which was a military base, and we were walking there, and there were some kids throwing rocks at the soldiers who were there, and then all of a sudden a soldier appears in front of me and gives me a very hard kick, and I go running, of course, there. And that was my first kind of confrontation with this, where I understood everything that was happening all at once. My teenagehood was then in the 1990s, and that's when we were hearing the discourse of peace and statehood and independence, but at the same time, exponential expansion of the colonies, the entrenching of the checkpoint system, or the restrictions on the freedom of movement. This is when, in 1991, for example, when Gaza was completely cut off. The famous Erez checkpoint, for example, was put, and it acted the way it continued to act, as really a block between Gaza, the West Bank, of course, and Palestine, 1948. That started in 1991, and that was around the time also that checkpoints were placed around the different areas around in the West Bank, separating the West Bank from 1948, and of course, the physical separation between the West Bank and Gaza. And I remember at the time, when, for example, perhaps some of you who have visited Palestine know the Qalandia checkpoint. It's one of the infamous checkpoints that separates Ramallah from Jerusalem. And I always say I grew up with Qalandia. I remember Qalandia not being there at all, because I lived in Ramallah, but my grandparents' house was in Jerusalem. I would go to school in Ramallah and then take karate classes in Jerusalem. So I remember it not being there. Then I remember when it was a military jeep blocking the road, and then a cement block was added. So you had a cement block and a military jeep, and then another military jeep. So it's two with a cement block, and then the cement block became 2, 3, 4, 5, until now a massive structure that is there separating Ramallah from Jerusalem. So, for example, a trip that would take 10 minutes between my home and my grandmother's home now takes several hours, and actually since the beginning of October it was sometimes impossible to go and visit. And I graduated from school in 2001 with the second Intifada. It's again when Palestinians took to the streets and to popular action. It was perhaps more militarized. than the first one. But that's when I finished school and I went to study. Then I was privileged to be able to study outside. I went to the United States and came back home, and I married. I want to say a little bit here about my family. I married a refugee from Jaffa. Her father's family was expelled from Jaffa to Gaza. Her uncles are still right now in Jabalia. They've actually stayed in Jabalia, which is in the north. And if you've been following, of course, I mean, the situation in the north is the worst when it comes to, relatively, to the situation in Gaza, but they are there right now. And we're, because of the apartheid system, and I'll come to this in a little bit, we are classified differently by apartheid Israel. So I have a different legal status than my wife, which means that there are roads, for example, where I can go on and she cannot go on. There are checkpoints that I can pass, but she cannot pass. If we are to travel outside of the country, we cannot travel the same way. I would need to go through the airport, for example, while she would have to go through Jordan. Our kids cannot be registered by both, so they're only registered under my name, for example. So she can never take the kids. You know, we have a good family. I'm assuming, you know, something happens in you know, domestic problems. You know, for example, she wouldn't be, for example, take the kids at all. She would have no rights to the children at all. And this is because of, you know, this is a crucial part of kind of the apartheid system that is based on fragmentation. So I just wanted to kind of like say all of this to bring then to the second part that I want to talk about. That after I finished my graduate schools and I studied human rights, I started working with human rights organizations. And I spent around 14 years working with renowned international human rights organizations. I started with Human Rights Watch. I was a field researcher for the organization in Palestine. And then I went and joined Amnesty International. Eventually, leaving in 2022, after I led and co-authored the report, the organization's report on Israel's apartheid. But during this period, there's what seems like, for me, reflecting back on it, what seems like a paradox. And I'm speaking here from kind of a human rights worker or researcher perspective. And the paradox is as following, that during these years, there's been increased exposure and addressing of Israel's systematic human rights violations, yet at the same time, these systematic human rights violations were more and more entrenched. So I started with Amnesty in 2011. It was a year or 2 years after Israel's attack on Gaza, 2008, 2009. A few years after the criminal siege was imposed, starting in 2007. And if you remember at the time, there was this groundbreaking report by the Human Rights Council, where a commission of inquiry was set up, the Goldstone report it was called. It was led by Judge Richard Goldstone from South Africa, that looked at Israel's policies and practices during the 2008-2009 attack, and came to these very damning conclusions that Israel has perpetrated war crimes and crimes against humanity and so on, and made a big fuss at the time. And there was, of course, the attack on the Human Rights Council itself and on the commission and even on the judge himself. Even like personal attacks, creating problems for him with his family in South Africa and so on. But that was a big moment, because we've never seen such exposure of Israel's practices before. In 2012, Israel carries another military attack on Gaza. And again, we see kind of another exposure, independent commissions, special rapporteurs set up by the Human Rights Council of the United Nations, condemnations by different UN bodies and so on. In 2014 was a very big incident. you know, the 2014 war on Gaza, which, among other things, was known for the policy of exterminating entire families while they were in their homes. And it was Ramadan at the time. I remember, very similar to, you know, the time we are in right now. And some of the cases I was documented, I was not allowed to enter Gaza in 2014, as with other human rights workers. Israel and Egypt prevented us from entering to be able to document firsthand, so we had to rely on colleagues in Palestinian human rights organizations who were working under really the most dangerous and risky of situations. I would be speaking to colleagues, you know, going to places where Israel would bomb, and while we are on the phone, I could hear the mobbing sometimes around them. And they were always courageous, always in high spirit, always making jokes also about what they were doing. In 2014, we've seen afterwards something that was very significant and a bit gave us a glimpse of hope, where Palestine, that was admitted as an observer member state of the United Nations, was able then to join treaties and conventions, and then signed the Rome Statute of the International Criminal Court, and therefore provided the court jurisdiction over the occupied Palestinian territories, including, of course, Gaza here, and including the 2014 war. And I remember I was still investigating the war. I was still looking at different kind of violations and different attacks and crimes and so on, when I would be speaking to people on the phone trying to collect information, that then this ICC thing became, you know, part of the questions they would ask me. You know, what does this mean now? They would say, will we now see justice? Will we see Israeli war criminals arrested? Will we see an arrest warrant even? We just wanted to see an arrest warrant. Is this possible? Will I see, you know, my house rebuilt that was demolished? And of course that was far off, but we thought at the time that that was, you know, a beginning of something different here, that, you know, international law actually may have an impact, it may have a meaning, and it maybe can create a change. Maybe it would at least deter Israel from carrying another 2014 attack against Gaza, for example. Just before, actually, the war in 2014, I had carried out an investigation into a pattern of unlawful killings by Israeli forces in the West Bank. And there was a spike at the time of killing of young men, and including children, in refugee camps and so on. Following the report, when we finished it, it was called Trigger Happy. I went to present it to some of the communities that I had worked with in the report, and one of them was the village of Nabi Saleh, just outside of Ramallah. It's a village that was struggling against the confiscation by settlers of a water spring that they relied on for their agriculture. Since the settlers took over that water spring, the village of Nabi Saleh, it's a very small village of 500 people, started organizing weekly protests. Every Friday they would go out and try to reach the spring, and every Friday they would be met with brutal force. Many members were, of course, severely injured, some were killed. There was collective punishment of, for example, puncturing the water tanks above their houses, cutting electricity and so on, firing tear gas directly inside of homes where there were babies and children, but they endured that and they continued on the struggle. And because I was investigating what was happening and documenting what happened in Nabi Saleh, I went after the publication of the report to present it along with colleagues to the activists there. And I remember an activist, his name is Bassem Tamimi. He's currently in prison. You might have heard of his daughter, Ahmed Tamimi, who was also in prison and released. Many members of the community are right now in prison. I remember him, of course, as some of you would know, the Palestinians very welcoming and very smiling and so on, and brought us in and said, "Thank you very much for the report. It's great work. Very important." And he picks up a copy of the report, which I just kind of handed to him, and he opens the recommendations page of the Amnesty report and says, you know, thank you again, but what I see here you doing is telling Israel how to kill us better. And what we meant there, because in the recommendation pages it was all, you know, Amnesty telling Israel what to do. You should, you know, have your open fire regulations reformed. You should have your use of force policies developed. You should have the, you know, military justice system act in a different way. You know, it was all, you know, trying to, you know, tell Israel to do better, but not really tackle the root causes of this. And that's what he was saying. You know, this is just, you know, a reform of an apartheid system. This is not the tackling of the root causes. This is not the tackling of the apartheid system. This is not removing, you know, the occupation. And that really, you know, and I was really glad to have my colleagues with me then, at the time that, you know, he was speaking the truth. It hit, you know, a nerve. You know, they got the message and took the message home, and since then started working in a process that brought the apartheid report. I'm sorry, I kind of went on a tangent with this, but what I want to say is, then after the 2014, the ICC, there was a glimpse of hope, but then 4 years after, in 2018, Palestinians in Gaza, majority of whom are refugees, mobilize in what was called the Great March of Return. They go to the separation barrier, and they make the demands as refugees, as their right under international law to return home, and for the criminal siege to be lifted. And they're met with some of the most gruesome colonial violence we have seen so far since 1967. Israel prepared mounds of dirt, placed snipers on there that really just picked Palestinians, killing them in their hundreds and injuring many in their thousands. And I remember a colleague, and it's something that is very kind of disturbing to say, but I remember a colleague telling me at the time, because it really kind of like, you know, hit a nerve as well. She was telling me that, you know, this kind of, you know, intentional, deliberate policy of, because all the injuries from 2018 were mostly in the knee, that led then to decapitations, right? The cutting of the legs of those who were injured. And that was intentional, that was done by snipers. And the reason for this, she was saying, is, you know, when you kill one person, you take that person away from the community. And the community would be able to kind of continue. Of course, there's the sadness, there's the sadness of the loss and all of that, all of what that means. But when you injure somebody, you've paralyzed the whole community, right? Because an injured person without a leg, especially a bread earner, for example, and they were all young men, that means that you need a nurse, the mother, the father, the brother, the child, whoever, to be taking care of them. So it becomes a paralyzing situation. And here you have been there thousands, you know, thousands of people have been injured in that way. So an ICC, primarily investigation and jurisdiction, yet we see kind of this increase in violence, all the way then to 2021. And in 2021, we get a popular uprising in Palestine. It's called the Unity and Dignity Intifada. It was a very hopeful moment that we still actually look back at. It's very relevant to today and so on. That was met, of course, with massive violence and repression. And it was an uprising of Palestinians all across colonized Palestine, which was in a way unprecedented. Well, not unprecedented, but we haven't seen such kind of unified action in Palestine since the 1970s, and before that perhaps in the 1930s. And after that, there was a new mechanism that was set up by the Human Rights Council at the UN. It's the Commission of Inquiry that is still working until today, unprecedented in its geographic and temporal mandate. meaning that for the first time, the Human Rights Council sets an investigative committee that looks not only at occupied Palestinian territories, but also at Israel. And we have an investigative committee headed by Judge Nabil Pillay, who was an ex-High Commissioner for Human Rights at the UN, and she's a South African judge, very renowned, also with that kind of like stature and so on, and also without any time limitations, meaning that it is an evergreen mandate. It was unprecedented that we have a mechanism like this, and again, kind of the hope rise up that, okay, so we have now an ICC investigation. Around that time also, the Office of the Prosecutor, it was Fatou Bensouda, before this, really ugly prosecutor that we have right now, Karim Khan, had officially opened an investigation. The Human Rights Council has also done something very significant in publishing a database of companies that were complicit in illegal Israeli settlements after a long fight by Palestinian civil society organizations and human rights defenders. And I'm mentioning all of this just if you see kind of two parallel lines here, where on one hand you see this systematic exposure and new mechanisms and so on of the human rights system that is part of this international law system that has been in place since the Second World War. At the same time, this deterioration and the continuing kind of entrenchment of the systematic human rights violations by Israel against Palestinians. And in 2022, we get then renowned international organizations, Human Rights Watch, Amnesty International, even Israeli organizations, come out and say that Israel is imposing a system of Jewish supremacy, a system of apartheid against Palestinians from the river to the sea, including Palestinian refugees who are denied their right of return. Also unprecedented, makes big noises. Again, you expect that with an exposure like this, with big organizations like this, coming out with very well documented, with evidence, very well, presenting kind of very strong legal analysis in these reports. The Amnesty report, for example, that I was involved in was one of the biggest in terms of kind of the size that the organization has produced. I remember joking, that we broke actually the record of the number of footnotes in any Amnesty report, for example. It was like some 1,400 footnotes that was in that report. Just to kind of like as a way to show just how much work has went into that report. And here we are, a year after that report was published, and these reports were published, we are in a genocide. I left Amnesty International because, and if you remember I was saying about that, what seems like a paradox is actually, I understood is actually not a paradox at all. Because what has been happening is allowed to be happening because of complicity. The complicity of states, institutions, corporations, organizations in Israel's crimes against the Palestinian people. And this complicity that exists in Ireland, right? They have very strong solidarity, you have very strong consciousness about what's happening, education, people are aware and so on, but yet there is still military support that comes through Ireland to Israel, including at a time of genocide, through Shannon Airport, for example. There's still trade with illegal settlements despite a bill that has been on the table for many years. Taxpayer money is being invested in companies that are complicit in war crimes and crimes against humanity that are being perpetrated against the Palestinians. Dual-use products that can be used in, including, for example, the genocide right now are being exported from Ireland to Israel. And there's no talk at the government level of sanctions whatsoever. So even in a place where you find very strong solidarity, there's still very high complicity. And we're not even mentioning here the UK, the US, and Germany who go beyond complicity. Now you have, these powers directly involved in the genocide that is being perpetrated in Gaza. And so recognizing this, I moved then to the BDS movement. And which brings me then to the third, and I promise I'm trying to wrap up very soon. You know what the BDS stands for. I want to say a little bit, and I think at this moment is also to say a little bit about the background of the BDS movement and where I work. I work at the PNC. This is the BDS National Committee. It's the Palestinian leadership of the global nonviolent movement that uses the BDS strategy to dismantle Israel's settler colonial apartheid. And the BDS call was, of course, made in 2005. Before it, there was the PACB call, the Palestinian Academic and Cultural Boycott of Israel call. And it comes at a time when the Palestinian anti-apartheid movement was kind of developing. In 2001, there was a meeting of civil society organizations in Durban, in South Africa, in the UN Anti-Racism Conference, and the Palestinian civil society organizations that were there made a call on other civil society organizations around the world to end Israel's apartheid. At the time, Israel was building what was called the Apartheid Wall. We had the Stop the Wall campaign that was established in 2002 that has clearly started using apartheid in the discourse. And then, of course, kind of the BDS adopts that language and popularizes it, mainstreams it, globalizes, the description and the framing of Israel as an apartheid state. And this is a very important achievement of the BDS movement. 2 years after the BDS call in 2005, the call to boycott Israel, divest from it, and impose sanctions against it, the BNC was formed, and the BNC is the largest coalition in Palestinian society. And I wanted here, because sometimes, I think it's important, and especially because we were talking about how, where the guidance comes from, for example, the leadership and so on, calling me boss when, I should be called boss at all. But just to say, and allow me to do this, is just to kind of read the list of the members of the BNC, right? As a way of kind of educating around it. And the BNC includes the Council of National and Islamic Forces in Palestine, the General Union of Palestinian Workers, the Palestinian Union of Postal, IT, and Telecommunication Workers, Palestinian Trade Union Coalition for BDS, PTUC BDS, Palestinian NGO Network, Palestinian National Institute for NGOs, Federation of Independent Trade Unions, Global Palestine Right of Return Coalition, Palestine Bar Association, Palestinian Medical Association, Occupied Palestine and Syrian Golan Heights Initiative, which Kairos is a member of, General Union of Palestinian Teachers, Palestinian Federation of Unions of University Professors and Employees, General Union of Palestinian Women, General Union of Palestinian Writers, Union of Palestinian Farmers, Grassroots Palestinian Anti-Apartheid War Campaign, Palestinian Campaign for the Academic and Cultural Boycott of Israel, Popular Struggle Coordination Committees, Palestinian Federation of New Unions, Civic Coalition for the Defense of Palestinian Rights in Jerusalem, Coalition for Jerusalem, National Committee to commemorate the Nakba, Union of Public Employees and Palestine Civil Sector, General Union of Palestinian Peasants, Union of Palestinian Charitable Organizations, Union of Professional Associations, Women Campaign to Boycott Israeli Products, Palestinian Economic Monitor, Union of Youth Activity Centers, Palestine Refugee Camps, Agricultural Cooperatives Union, National Committees for Grassroots Resistance, and the Palestinian General Federation of Trade Unions. Now, I'm sorry, that was long, but I wanted to kind of reflect how, this is the BNC. This is what, when we say the BDS movement, we mean basically the BNC, and this is the BNC. This is the General Assembly of the BNC, making up all these unions and federations. The NGO network, for example, has hundreds of civil society organizations that are a member. So when we say we're the largest coalition, this is what the largest coalition means. It's democratic. It engages together in a democratic way. It sets the policies. It sets the guidelines, for example, on what BDS means, how to carry out BDS campaigns, what normalization means, what the anti-normalization guidelines should look like, and so on. It gets voted on. The General Assembly, this committee elects a secretariat that are all also voluntary, that then appoints campaigners that do the research, devising, and support, for example, the BDS movement around. And I wanted to kind of, explain this, just for you to get, an understanding of then how the BDS movement at the Palestinian level works, and what this really, when we say kind of leadership, what this means. And the BDS theory of change is quite simple, that through people, grassroots, intersectional, coalition building action, that we are able to push for the change at the policy level that we want. That basically we cannot expect for policy to change by governments or officials waking up one day and deciding to change them. We have to force that change, and especially at this time of genocide right now. And I think this is quite, kind of reflective of, sitting between Kira and Patricia here, because it's what we're calling for is exactly, what has been presented. One, change at an institutional policy level, institutionalized change, and at the same time, direct action on the ground to disrupt, to change, to, for example, the action of the stores, the disruption of the business as usual, basically. So, one, in a way, to not be seasonal in our solidarity, right? And I wanted to mention this because in 2014, we've seen actually, in response to the war, massive protests around the world, very similar to what is happening today. There were hundreds of thousands of people in Malaysia, in Indonesia, in Europe, in Ireland, in the UK, and so on, that went in the streets because they were appalled by what was happening. It was really one of the most gruesome times. Does not compare anything to what is happening right now, but it was very gruesome at the time. And there were some successes in BDS. There was some impact. There were no groups that sprung up. But yet we are here in a very, a much worse situation, in a genocide, and it has to kind of really have us think about why that is. And why that is because it's, we allow then the solidarity to be seasonal, to be just in reaction to bloodshed, and then once the bloodshed stops, we stop it. And we also allow the solidarity to be reactionary. So it's going out to the street as important, and of course it's very crucial to go out in the thousands, in the millions, to show the solidarity. But what is really more important is to be able to disrupt the business as usual, to let those in power, the companies, know that it will not be normal for them as long as they are complicit in war crimes and crimes against humanity, and also then to be able to institutionalize policy change that will not allow the complicity, that will end the complicity now and never allow it to happen again. And my role in BDS in particular is to look at the S in BDS, is to look at how then we're able to move to this policy change, to be able, again, like for example, the situation in South Africa, is to have sanctions imposed on Israel, is to be able to put the change in policy so that there is punishment and there is the promise of non-repetition of this. And we have, despite, of course, the genocide, and despite all the shortcomings and perhaps the total failure of international law, we have an opportunity with South Africa bringing the case against Israel, accusing of genocide to the International Court of Justice, and the International Court of Justice ruling on provisional measures, confirming the plausibility of genocide. And that case and that ruling is perhaps what is until now saving or allowing this threat to save until now the system of international law that has been in place since the Second World War. And really this should provide us to put basically, and I hate to use this word, but it's been used by my colleagues, to put BDS on steroids. And really on steroids meaning, both the B, the D, and also now to move to the S. And to end with, since the ICJ ruling, we've seen a consensus emerge around sanctions. For the first time, we have almost all of the special rapporteurs of the Human Rights Council, those are the independent mechanisms, come out and call for a military embargo against Israel, and financial, economic, and cooperation sanctions against Israel. We've never heard this before from any UN or UN-associated body or official. Very important. We have today, actually, as we're speaking, the Special Rapporteur on the human rights situation in the occupied Palestinian territories, Francesca Albanese, has just made her report on genocide public, and I urge everybody to look at the report that will be presented to the Human Rights Council very soon. We've had Italy and Spain announce that they have suspended, although they lie, they suspended arms transfers to Israel. And it is a lie because we know that they continue to actually send weapons to Israel, but it tells you something, that they had to come out and declare that they've suspended arms transfers to Israel. A Dutch court has ordered that no F-35 fighter jet parts can be exported out of Dutch ports. Very significant. A district in Belgium, Wallonia, has suspended arms transfers licenses of companies to Israel. We've seen the Spanish Parliament, the Canadian Parliament, vote to stop the arms transfers to Israel. We've seen sanctions being called by the Deputy Prime Minister of Belgium. Also, a call for an arms embargo by the Deputy Prime Minister of Belgium and the Deputy Prime Minister of Spain. We've seen even, politicians get worried and be scared. Joseph Borrell, the EU Foreign Secretary, who we accused, rightly so, of being a genocide enabler, because very early on, of course, all the statements that were supportive of Israel, but also the claims that Hamas was using human shields, including hospitals, basically, which allowed Israel, along with other things, then to attack Al Ahli hospital, but also then to raid Al-Shifa and destroy the entire health system and hospitals that are there in Gaza. He played a very important role in the statements that he made. But then after the ICJ decision, Joseph Borrell comes and in what seems like, kind of a complete switch in position, criticizes the United States for sending weapons to Israel. And the only explanation for why he made that change is because he is worried about the ICJ decision, the possibility of genocide, and that he may be held liable because of statements he made that enabled the genocide. We've seen also change in the US, Kamala Harris, for example, the Vice President of the United States, come out and call ceasefire and so on. So we see an effect of this. And we need, as a people movement, is to be able to capitalize on this, to move and to use it to the most extent possible. And today I was hearing how that is even used in the kind of the direct action when removing Israeli products from stores, and how it's confronted with the police and they have no answer to that. So we can use it. We can use it, and we can use it in being able to escalate BDS. I want to end by saying the genocide in Gaza, and you know this very well. If Israel, the United States, the UK and Germany get away with the genocide in Gaza, we should know that this is going to usher in a world that the Secretary General of the United Nations called a world of chaos, where it is really free for all. That if you dare to challenge Western domination, you will be wiped out. And there's nobody that can do anything about it. If you are a small nation that stands against US policy, UK policy, German policy, and you try to challenge that, if Israel, the UK, the US, and Germany get away with the genocide in Gaza, know that this is going to be the law of the day. It's going to be jungle rule, it's going to be might makes right. And I think, and you know this very well, we should not allow this to happen. Not only for the sake of Palestinians, those in Gaza, but also for the entire world. I'm going to stop here. Thanks very much.